Okay, everybody. Hey, this is the last lecture in nutrient cycling. We're going to be talking about phosphorus. It's also the last lecture of the semester. So, yay! That's my celebration. And it also comes with a box of nerds because that's what I am. Okay. Um, so, we're going to talk about this last one here phosphorus. It's not as the most exciting as far as the other two lectures. Uh, it's a little bit more straightforward, which is good as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about this nutrient. Now, again, this is one of those limiting factors or limiting nutrients that we oftentimes see impacting plant populations and animal populations and things like that. Is also why when you look at the fertilizer, it has NPK ratios on there: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We're not going to worry about potassium. But there's another reason I wanted to go over phosphorus is it has a very different cycle than either nitrogen or carbon. So we're going to go through this one real quick. So the difference with phosphorus is both carbon and nitrogen have a atmospheric portion of that cycle, that they're moving atmospheric nitrogen into something that's biologically active in the form of ammonium, and then moving through systems and eventually being released back into the atmosphere. Uh, Carbon has a similar sort of thing where it has a portion where it's carbon dioxide and it's taken directly into plants that then can convert it into a biologically functional form of carbon that can be spread throughout ecosystems or throughout, different species and things like that through that. Phosphorus, however, does not have a portion where it's really ever got an atmospheric portion. It cycles between rocks, and then basically once those rocks are brought up to the surface of the environment, the Earth's surface, they get eroded, weathered, and release the phosphorus back from those rocks, and quickly it gets incorporated into the soil and into plants and things like that. Eventually, it runs off into aquatic systems and gets brought to the ocean where it sinks down to the bottom of the ocean or bottom of whatever aquatic system that it's sitting in, lakes or oceans. Has to be one of those, lotic systems that is lentic systems that are not moving. And then suddenly it settles down to the bottom where it is buried under sediment and eventually forms rocks again until it's brought back up to the surface. So that's kind of the cycle going on here. So those rocks that have been underground, pressure, time, heat, all those tend to form or compress that phosphorus into a inorganic form, a phosphate type rock. That rock sits there for long periods of time until some sort of geological event brings it up to the surface. That can be erosion, or it can be uplift, or it can be it can be mining. That's what we kind of do to get to it. We actually mine for it. We dig for phosphates. Um, phosphate mines are very important for our ability to continue growing crops at a effective speed and concentration, and we add it to our fertilizers and things like that. But this rock gets brought up, it erodes either physically or chemically, and it releases the phosphate from that rock, and that rock then, the surrounding ecosystem then is able to get access to it. Plants usually are the ones that are gaining a lot of phosphorus from the soil. They get it and they incorporate it into them, and then you have the herbivores that eat the phosphorus and the carnivores that eat the herbivores and stuff like that. And as they die, that phosphorus can get reincorporated back into the soil where it can, do a smaller tight cycle. But eventually what ends up happening is that phosphorus gets back into the ocean. Those phosphorus mines were really, really important once we discovered where they were, and they continue to be important to this day. Similar to, I talked a little bit about bird poop with regards to nitrogen sources. Bird poop was also a big source of phosphate fertilizer for agriculture as well. And if you look at that little box of bat guano, that's that's my cereal I eat in the morning. No, I'm kidding. If you look at those numbers under the word bat guano on there, it says 3-10-1. And that again is the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratio. So you can see the second number, 10, is the amount of phosphorus relative to nitrogen, the first number, and potassium, the third number. So bat guano is very high in phosphorus, as is bird guano. Both of them are really rich in phosphorus and have been collected for eons as a means to incorporate phosphorus back into the soil. So that's kind of our way of increasing that phosphorus. But as I said, once that rock gets eroded, it releases the phosphorus into the soil. It tends to bind to the soil. It gets taken up by plants. Any excess of phosphorus that's not taken up eventually will leach out of the soil and fall into local aquatic systems, streams, rivers, lakes, or the ocean. Once it gets into a lentic system or a system like a lake, something like that, phosphorus has a tendency to not stay dissolved in water for very long. So this is one of the things that acts as a limiting resource in aquatic systems as well, because what happens is that phosphorus precipitates out and sinks down to the bottom. And we talked a little bit about lake turnover and that idea of seasonal changes in where that thermocline is in the lake, and how that can impact algal blooms and things like that. Well, this is one of the main reasons that it impacts algal blooms, is because phosphorus collects at the bottom of those lakes. And once the temperature on the top of the lake equals the temperature at the bottom, you see the drop of that thermocline, or a hypolimnion. I'm sorry, the hypolimnion equals the epilimnion. Then you don't have this thermocline that separates the top from the bottom, and you have the water suddenly start being cycled from the bottom all the way back up to the top, where it normally doesn't happen when there's a big temperature difference between the surface and the bottom of the lake. This is what brings it. This is the main nutrient that gets cycled during that lake turnover. Okay, is phosphorus. It's bringing phosphorus that wasn't soluble in the water back up to the surface, where it then can be consumed and incorporated into photosynthetic organisms like algae and things like that, and provides a huge boost in those nutrients. Phosphorus tends to be a really big limiting resource because in aquatic systems, because of the fact that it is not very soluble in water and does tend to trickle down or sink down to the bottom. This is also why when we talked a little bit about weather patterns and the Hadley cell and the Ferrel cell and things like that. I said there are certain portions of the ocean that are super rich and super productive, and a lot of this has to do with this idea of moving phosphorus from the bottom of the ocean back up to the surface where it's available again. Okay, so anytime that you have the general wind currents blowing across a landscape and then hitting the ocean, so it's blowing the ocean currents away from a large landmass, what ends up happening is that top layer gets pushed away. That leaves a space for the bottom to pull the bottom water, the water at the bottom of the ocean, back up to the surface. And with that comes some of that phosphorus that has sunk down to the bottom. Again, this is a limiting resource in a lot of aquatic systems. So once those algae and things like that get the phosphorus they need, they have a big bloom, and that again provides that autotroph, or that producer layer of the trophic levels that then can support huge amounts of consumers, multiple layers of consumers in that trophic level, because you've suddenly brought and added a limiting resource to those producers in that area. So you increase the amount of production, of primary production. You're going to be able to support a lot more of those trophic levels above the producer level. Okay. We do see this being a problem in some systems, in the sense that we've actually, through mining and through things like that, and through addition of phosphorus to our fertilizers, we do see this be a problem sometimes as far as pollution. So if you look at most all of, in fact, I think it is all detergents now for your clothes. Most all of them are phosphate free. Phosphate is a good way, a good component of a lot of cleaners, but they make them phosphate free now because of the fact that it was causing, or is causing, a big problem with regards to aquatic pollution. It causes eutrophication. So if you look here in the bottom right corner, or the diagram of the Canadian lake experiment, or the picture there, what they did is they found a lake that had two kind of a narrowing in the middle, and they put a barrier that was permeable to water but not to phosphate. So it was a semi-permeable membrane that went all the way down to the bottom of the lake, and they added phosphorus to one side and they didn't to the other. And you can see the huge difference between the two sides of that barrier. One side looks relatively clean, and the other one is just this lime green, funky looking thing that has lots and lots of algae that's covering that surface. And again, this can be problematic because once that surface layer of algae gets too thick, suddenly phosphorus doesn't become a limiting resource, but light becomes a limiting resource because you've decreased how much light can penetrate. So what ends up happening is that light compensation point in that lake suddenly rises really, really high, so that you've got this area real close to the surface that can support photosynthesis, but it don't have to go too far before you get below that light compensation point, which means anything that's photosynthetic below that doesn't have enough light to survive. So it dies. It sinks down to the bottom and begins to decompose. As it decomposes, the things that are decomposing it, the bacteria and things like that, are conducting respiration to decompose it, so they consume all the oxygen, which the result is that you have the bottom of those types of lakes tend to have really, really super low concentrations of oxygen. They become hypoxic, or really low oxygen concentrations, and this can result in death of most vertebrate species, because there's not enough oxygen deeper down in the lake, because all of it has been consumed by decomposition of producers that are now too deep in the lake to be able to photosynthesize, because you have such a huge density of floating algae at the surface. Okay, like I said, this was a real short one. I'm going to stop while I'm ahead here. Thanks. We do have our final exam is going to be the 7th of May. Let me double check that. Yes, it is the 7th of May from 3 to 6. This is the last lecture that will be on there. It will be cumulative. I'm going to shoot y'all an email and see about doing a Zoom on Monday that we can discuss further. Also, this is the last piece of the puzzle for your ecosystem paper. I'll send you an email and talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, thank you very much, y'all, and thanks for being patient this semester. For those of y'all are graduating, congratulations. It was awesome teaching y'all. I've had several of y'all in multiple classes and really enjoyed it. For those of y'all that are still going to be here next year, I hope to have you in more classes. It's been a fun class. I enjoy this class, and y'all have been a great group of students to work with. Thanks. Bye.